Good evening, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Watchdog, exclusively on the Synagogue News, where we want to encourage you to think like the Neanderthal they already say you are anyway. I am your host, CJ Cox, here to tell you that we are indeed living in biblical times, and my friends, the times get more and more biblical. I was realizing yesterday, I'm kind of a little superstitious sometimes. And yesterday happened to be a lunar eclipse, blood moon as they commonly call it. And then the reported red wave that was supposed to happen then, did not happen. And I just thought it was kind of funny, right? Because does that actually have anything to do with it? Probably not, right? But it's just funny to me that I can, sometimes feel superstitious about stuff. And it seems like, there seems like there's always something to look at if you really want to look at it. But obviously, that's just clowning around kind of stuff. To be serious, though, we're going to do some election analysis tonight. I appreciate every single one of you guys who is here. If you are here, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Um, Also, consider following us on any of the various social media platforms which you frequent. I am on Parler, I am on Gab, Minds, Twitter, and Facebook as well. You can find links to all of those in the description down below, or just look me up on any of those websites at the tag The Synagogue. I certainly do appreciate any of you who are following me on there. I want to give a special shout out to the alternative social media platforms, namely Gab, Parler, and Minds, because we are firm believers of free speech on the internet. And obviously, the people who currently control internet speech, Facebook, Twitter, groups like that, are not interested in defending your free speech. So, rather than relying upon the big companies or relying upon Elon Musk or relying upon the government wherever you happen to live, you can instead choose to rely on the people who have actually demonstrated they have an interest in defending your free speech by getting on Gab, Parler, or Minds. Not sponsored, but nonetheless, certainly do appreciate giving them a shout out. Hope you guys consider getting an account on any of those different websites. And while you're there, maybe sharing this video there and also following your boy. Also, you can find a link in the description to our Rumble account. Rumble is where we upload all these videos after the fact. Very good reason to do that. It's because, as it turns out, shocker, I know, YouTube does not like conservative political content. So we have a backup channel over there on Rumble to make sure that we can always be giving you guys the news at some point, even though it might be a little bit later when we go to Rumble. We've already been censored here on this channel before, so it's definitely important for us to be on Rumble, and I certainly do appreciate anybody who decides to follow us over there as well. Again, link is in the description down below. What else should we talk about? Oh, yes, if you want to contribute to us financially, you can certainly do so. Both the link to our PayPal as well as to our Patreon are found in the description down below. If you think that this is good news content, and appreciate the content that we're putting forward for you, certainly do appreciate anybody who demonstrates that by way of their giving. Of course, if you are giving, you are indeed voting with your dollar, telling us that you believe we are providing some level of clarity and truth in the massive muck of filth and lies that is news broadcasting and constant podcasting here on the internet. So I certainly appreciate you guys giving us that vote of confidence. Of course, those of you who are just watching, liking, sharing, all those kinds of things, you are also giving a vote of confidence. So I appreciate y'all as well. If you're not watching this live, leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. If you are watching this live, please tag me at the Synagogue News if you have any of the like, and I will answer all questions at the end of the broadcast. Certainly do appreciate anybody who is participating here again, and want to give a quick shout out to Chris Lucas, who is currently in the live chat. Nobody else has made themselves known in the live chat yet, but nonetheless, I do see you guys. StreamYard lets me know how many of you guys are watching here, so I know you're here, and I appreciate you being here. And that, of course, is that. So, want to give you guys our This Day in History fun fact. I actually have two fun facts for you today. Two different birthdays happened today. That is November the 10th, 2022. The first one is Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born November the 10th, 1483. He, of course, would go on to be the famous monk Catholic monk at the time, but would eventually become Protestant, of course, founding the whole Protestant Reformation. He would become the famous monk, of course, who would nail the 95 Theses onto the Wittenberg church door, which of course would kickstart the Protestant Revolution, which had been kind of sitting there simmering for quite some time. In fact, you could even argue upwards of 200 years if you look at guys like Jan Hus and John Wycliffe and all that. But, his nailing of the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg ended up, making for whatever reason, huge splash where other people didn't necessarily make a huge splash. And as a result, we got the Protestant Reformation. So very cool there. But also, November the 10th, 1775 was the birth of the United States Marine Corps. So today is not only the birthday of Martin Luther, it is also the birthday of the United States Marine Corps. And those are two very interesting history facts I want to share with you guys today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into our discussion period. Sorry, I had to plug in my computer charger there. All right, so jumping into our discussion period. So there has been a hashtag going around Twitter. Hashtag repeal the 19th. Now, for those of you who do not know, the 19th Amendment is the amendment which gives women the right to vote. It was not a part of the original Constitution. It, became a part of the Constitution in 1920. This was actually, let's see, no, this wouldn't have been the 100-year anniversary. 2 years ago would have been the 100-year anniversary, but 102 years ago when women first got the right to vote. And it has recently been pointed out by numerous pundits as well as people on Twitter that unmarried women voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. I believe it was something like 68% of unmarried women voted for the Democratic Party, with something like 31% voting for the Republican Party. And of course, other various, women voting for third parties and independents, although for the most part, that was not something that was happening. And so as a result, a lot of people, having noticed this, are saying, we should repeal the 19th Amendment, are saying things like giving women the right to vote was one of the worst mistakes we'd ever made here in American history. And I wanted to say a couple things on this because I already have relatively controversial views on voting, and yet I kind of don't like this hashtag for a couple of reasons. First off, let me lay out what I mean by I have controversial views on voting. I do not believe that voting is a right. It is not a right in the same way that the rest of our human rights are rights. Excuse me 1 minute, I got to sneeze. Excuse me. So you have a right to bear arms. You have a right to freedom of religion. You have a right to freedom of speech. You have a right to trial by jury. These are things which I would consider not just constitutional rights, which are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, but I would consider these to be human rights. In other words, you don't have a right to compel any person, citizen or not, adult or not, doesn't matter about their gender, doesn't matter about their race, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have a right to compel anybody to follow a religion that is not theirs. You don't have a right to violate anybody's free practice of religion, of course, provided they're not actively hurting somebody else. That is the one caveat. Can't be kidnapping people for human sacrifices, right? But you guys get the point. Same thing with speech, same thing with press, same thing with assembly, same thing with right to trial by jury, right? I'm going to say the word right too much times because I'm talking about rights, and then I also say right after my sentences. Apologize for that in advance. But nonetheless, these things are human rights. These things are not things which are dependent, in my view, at least, on your status as a citizen, on your race, on your age, on your gender, things of that nature. But voting certainly is, right? Non-citizens, for example, do not have a right to vote in our country. Children do not have a right to vote in our country. Felons do not have a right to vote in our country. So on and so forth. There are various ways that we remove the quote unquote right to vote. And sometimes I even think we're a little bit too lenient with the privilege of voting. For example, I don't believe there's any reason whatsoever why a 32-year-old guy collecting Cheeto dust on his belly button ring, um, you know, still living with his parents, never been married, doesn't work a job, hasn't been properly educated, any of this other kind of stuff, right? Just sitting up there basically wasting space. I don't see any reason why that man should be allowed to vote and should be making decisions on how it is we run our country. It seems completely preposterous to me that just because he exists and happens to be past a certain age, he should actually have the privilege of voting and making decisions as far as where our country is going to go governmentally. That makes absolutely no sense to me. It shouldn't make any sense to you. Um, in my opinion, we should limit voting only to people who are productive in society, whether that be because they're mothers or because they have a job or because they are students. You know, in college students, I mean, right? Obviously, we don't want high schoolers voting because they're children, things of that nature. I don't feel like people who are literal dregs on society should be given the privilege of voting in this country. I also think that you should have to demonstrate you understand the issues in order to vote. Not that you have a certain position, but like, so for example, when somebody asks the question, what is the Second Amendment? You should be able to say the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms, the right to have a militia, and then you can vote on the different issues that pertain to that. And of course, I'm being very general with this because I want to get through this very quickly. But you get the point. I think we're too lenient on voting. Um, and yet, despite my pretty controversial views on voting, I find this repeal the 19th hashtag to be in very poor taste for a couple of reasons. Number one, it sounds to me like cheating, right? It sounds to me like conservatives are noticing, hey, we got clobbered in the unmarried women demographic. And the response there seems to be, okay, therefore, unmarried women shouldn't be voting. And that to me seems like poor sportsmanship, for lack of a better term. It to me seems like cheating, right? It to me seems like, oh, we lost, so therefore we need to rig the rules to make sure we don't lose next time. And I don't appreciate that at all. If the Democrats were doing the same thing, for example, Republicans tend to do better with people 65 years or older. If they said, hey, we should be putting a voting cap on people who are 65 years or older because they were losing, that to me would seem kind of like some funny business. I think it would seem to you all like some funny business. I don't think any conservative on the planet would conclude that there's something normal about that, right? And yet, if we were to if we were to look at what conservatives are talking about online, a lot of them are saying, hey, we should be repealing the 19th Amendment because of how badly conservatism did with unmarried women. I don't appreciate that. Now, if there's people out there who believed that the 19th Amendment should have been repealed before this, that's obviously different. You'd have to argue now on the merits of women having the right to vote there, which isn't necessarily what my particular rant is about today. But I don't appreciate this changing of this moving of the goalposts that we are seeing from conservatives in regards to voting. And it's not just with the 19th Amendment, they're doing it also with the voting age. Now, it's one thing for somebody like myself to come up here and say, hey, I think that the voting age is too low at the age of 18 because I've been saying that, right? I've been an advocate for voting reform and restricting voting for quite some time now. But when somebody's going to say, hey, everybody should have the right to vote on November 7th, November 8th comes around and the candidate they want to win loses. And then November 9th, they all of a sudden think that the voting age should be moved up to 21 or 25 or something like that. That's fishy. That sounds like you just don't like losing. And now you want to rig the rules to make sure you don't lose again. And that's very much what this whole repeal of the 19th thing is sounding like to me. Also, on top of that, it is only the unmarried women demographic where we ended up getting so clobbered in this election. Married women, for example, voted predominantly Republican, actually. Not that Republican is necessarily synonymous with conservative, it certainly isn't, but over 50% of married women, I think it was 56%, if I remember correctly, voted Republican in the 2022 election. So though all those votes obviously would be going down the drain as well if the 19th Amendment were repealed. And again, I just emphasize, if Democrats were doing the same thing, if Democrats were saying, hey, 65 or older, you shouldn't be able to vote, married women shouldn't be able to vote because they're too influenced by their spouses or whatever it happened to be, right? We would have a big problem with that. And we would accuse them of moving the goalpost. We would accuse them of trying to cheat. We would accuse them of trying to rig the rules. The same things that we accuse them of, rightfully so, by the way, when they decide, hey, we need to add more people to the Supreme Court, or when they say, hey, we need to get rid of the filibuster, or when they say, hey, we need to add Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C. as states, thus giving themselves 4 new senators, and so on and so forth, right? We would have a problem with it. So why do we not have a problem with members of our own ranks saying we need to raise the voting age because we lost with younger voters, or saying we need to repeal the 19th Amendment because we lost with unmarried women? It sounds fishy to me. It sounds, and by the way, I'd like to point out there's a gentleman in my live chat, Chris Lucas, says, I don't think Roman Catholics should be able to run for office. How can we trust that they're going to be loyal to America when they are more loyal to America, than they are to a country called the Vatican when they call the leader the Holy Father? And if that's a view you hold, one of the things, the reason I even say this is because I know Chris Lucas held that view on November 7th, right? In other words, he didn't just notice, hey, Catholics are voting a certain way on November 8th and then change his mind. Now, do we disagree with that or not? Well, we'd have to have that conversation, right? There is something to be said about the fact that Roman Catholics do have allegiance to a foreign national who is obviously a sovereign leader of another nation, namely the Vatican City. But nonetheless, the point is, I know he's had that view before the election ever happened. He didn't notice the election and the Catholics were voting a certain way and then say, oh, now all of a sudden, I don't think Catholics should vote. And it's similar here. If you have a position that the 19th Amendment should be repealed, or you have a position that 21-year-olds and up only should be allowed to vote, or 25-year-olds and up only should be allowed to vote, or a position more like mine where it's like you can't be a non-productive drag on society and be allowed to vote. That doesn't make any sense. If you held that position on November 7th, I don't necessarily have the current beef that I have with you. And I mean the current beef because obviously, I'm not going to disagree on everybody's specific voting restrictions. But nonetheless, I think I've made the point there. I don't appreciate this repeal the 19th hashtag. It sounds to me like poor sportsmanship. It sounds to me like it's just people kind of being, what's the word here, I guess, dishonest in a way. And I don't like it. I don't like it. If you held the view before November 7th, all right, I guess that's different. If you're waking up November 9th, November 10th, so on and so forth, reading what the voting demographics ended up being, and then coming to the conclusion that you don't like these things, I got a big problem, right? And again, if the Democrats were doing the same thing, you'd have a big problem too. But with that, let's go ahead and move into some of the commentary I have on the election itself. These are some post-election thoughts that I have. And I think that you guys will appreciate a lot of them, though I will freely admit a lot of them are going to be quite cynical. So, actually, let me get a brief drink of my tea here real quick before I go on another rant. All right. So, the first thing that needs to be mentioned is that the red wave didn't happen, right? Now, we are here on November the 10th, still waiting for a couple elections to finish. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put on my screen the Nevada election, so because that's going to be something we're going to be talking about rather in depth here. Not everything is done, right? So we still don't know who's going to end up holding the House. We still don't know who's going to end up holding the Senate. As you can see on your screen, currently 46 Democrats have seats in the Senate, 48 Republicans have seats in the Senate. Maine's Angus King and Vermont's Bernie Sanders are not affiliated with any political party, though they both caucus with Democrats and have very liberal views. And we have Alaska, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia yet to be decided. In the case of Alaska, Nevada, and Arizona, it's because the votes have not yet been counted. And in the case of Georgia, it is because nobody crossed over the 50% threshold that is necessary in that state to actually win. You can't win just with a majority of votes. You have to win with a outright majority of votes. In other words, over 50%. Nobody was able to do that. And so as a result, Georgia is going to go in about a month to what is known as a runoff election, where all of the third parties will be eliminated because they were not able to cross a certain threshold. Basically, only the top two candidates will be allowed to rerun, and then they'll just have the election over again. So we'll end up seeing who wins there. Not every state has that whole concept, but a lot of states do have this concept of, you can't have, if you win, meaning you have more than the other guys, but you only get 49.9% of the vote, then they're not going to actually allow you to be the senator, right? Excuse me. So we don't know whether or not the Republicans are going to have the Senate yet. Likewise, I'll show you guys the image here. We don't know if the Republicans are going to have the House yet either. A lot of elections here to be decided, significantly more than than what we have on the other side. Looks like if I'm doing my math correctly here, there are 32 seats in the House of Representatives that are yet to be decided. GOP currently heads with 211, while the Democrats head with 192. Other parties do not hold any seats, but all of these lightly colored regions here are circuits which have not actually yet completed their vote. So, a lot of these seats or a lot of these elections are yet to be determined as well. We don't know who's going to have the House yet. And with governor, similar thing. We do not know where a lot of these are going to end up going. There are currently 24 governors who are Republican, 23 who are Democrat, and at least three, I think actually only three, Nevada, Arizona, and Alaska, have not fully counted the votes yet, so we don't know what's going to necessarily happen there. So the red wave did not happen, right? The red wave just simply did not happen. Assuming, and I don't think this will be the case, so I'll let you guys know what I think will be the case in a moment, but assuming all four of these open elections in the Senate end up going to the Republicans, that would put the Republicans at 52 in the Senate, with 46 Democrats and 2 independents who caucus with Democrats. So for all intents and purposes, 48 Democrats. Here in the House, excuse me, that's 32 seats that are still left to be called. If all 32 of those seats went for the Republicans, that would be 243, which would be quite the majority, but that's definitely not going to happen. I think everybody kind of knows that. And if all 3 of the elections for for governors went in favor of the Republicans, that would be 27. And again, that's likely not going to happen. Those would all be best case scenarios for a red wave. And in only one of those scenarios, namely the House scenario, is there anything even remotely similar to a quote red wave, right? If you start being a little bit more realistic, not only is there not a red wave, I don't even think you could say there is a red ripple, as some people are saying, right? So Pennsylvania, for example, had a Republican senator before the 2022 election. Now he ends up stepping down, so we're going to get a new senator here. Obviously, it was John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz. Mehmet Oz, one of the worst candidates that the Republican Party has ever put forward in any capacity whatsoever. And he did end up losing to John Fetterman, which means that was actually a flipped seat, in the other direction. And thus far, it is the only flipped seat in the entire country, right? So, as it stands right now, with 4 states yet to be decided, only one seat in the Senate has actually been flipped, and it was not flipped red, it was flipped blue. What's going to happen in these other states will end up determining whether or not this is canceled out somehow. Before this election, it was about 50-50 technically 50-48, but again, two of the two independents both caucus with the Democrats. Those are Angus King and Bernie Sanders. But if we get one of these other states, which are blue, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia, to flip to the Republican side, then that will just put you at a dead neutral, the Senate being exactly where it was in 2020. That's certainly not a red wave, nor is it a red ripple. It is just pure neutrality. Everything stays as it was. Is that going to happen? Maybe. It's possible. We're currently at 90% reporting here in the state of Nevada. And Laxalt, the Republican candidate, does have a small lead of just under 9,000. In fact, it's 8,988. It's about 1 percentage point, as you may be able to see. I don't know how well it's showing up on your screen right now, but nonetheless. So if he wins, that will cancel out Pennsylvania's flip, because that'll be a flip here on Nevada. Nevada had a blue senator originally, which would, again, put us back at 50-50. There, like I said, is still 10% left to be counted, but we are getting pretty close to the end of the race. I don't want anybody to start declaring victory or anything like that. We certainly don't want to get excited before it's actually been decided. But nonetheless, it is possible that we go back to 50-50. Alaska is absolutely going to be a Republican because, as you can see here, it's a Republican versus a Republican. With 80% reporting, Kelly Tshibaka is currently leading against Lisa Murkowski. Tshibaka is significantly more conservative than Murkowski, so that's actually kind of nice. But regardless, it's not flipping. It's just going from red to red. So if we get Nevada and Alaska, that'll be 50 solid. And that is a very real possibility. In fact, I think that's likely, though, again, we don't want to start just declaring victory in Nevada when the votes have not yet been counted. That leaves these other two states, Arizona and Georgia. And I got to be honest with you, I am not confident the Republicans will win either. If we go to Arizona, we can see 82% reporting. So there's still 18% of the vote left to be counted. But Mark Kelly has quite a significant lead over Blake Masters, over 100,000 votes. The exact count that he has over Blake Masters is 115,037 votes, which you can see by the percentage points here is 4.6%. It's not very likely that the remaining 18% coming in is going to end up turning this into Masters' favor. So what we're likely going to see there is Mark Kelly reelected as Senator of Arizona. That means that goes to the Democrats. That puts them at 47. Effectively 49 if you consider Angus King and Bernie Sanders Democrats, which, again, that is who they caucus with. And then Georgia will obviously have to go to a runoff election. But as you can see here, with third parties still counted, obviously, Warnock did get the majority of votes. And not a lot of Republicans have faith in Herschel Walker. In fact, I don't have faith in Herschel Walker because Herschel Walker is, much like Mehmet Oz, one of the worst candidates the Republican Party has ever put forward in any capacity. He is a dishonest man. He is a absent father, a man who is paid to abort his own child, a man who has serially philandered on his wife, a man who has beaten his wife, a man who has very serious mental health issues. In other words, he's not a man who many conservatives are super ecstatic about voting for, nor is he a man who's likely going to convince a lot of people who are in the undecided, in undecided median, or people who don't usually vote, right? So I think it's very likely that Raphael Warnock ends up being elected in the runoff election here, though, of course, I could certainly be wrong about that. But assuming I'm right, that would mean Warnock elected here, Kelly elected here, Laxalt elected here, which is a Republican, and then, of course, Tshibaka or Murkowski doesn't matter, though I think Tshibaka will end up winning. So that would put us at 50 GOP seats, 48 Democratic seats, with 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats, and you would be literally exactly where you already were in the year 2020. No red wave, not even a red ripple. We just simply exchanged Pennsylvania senator for Nevada senator in that scenario. And again, that's the scenario I think is going to actually happen. On the gubernatorial seat, we actually have lost certain seats so far. You can actually see it right here. It tells you how many seats have been lost. Maryland was held by a Republican. That has now gone to a Democrat. I don't remember what the other one was. I don't want to say what it is because I'm not sure what it is. I believe it might have been Kansas. But regardless, two different seats here have actually gone to the Republicans, one of which was Maryland, but I can't remember what the other one was, so I do apologize. And the Republicans have yet to flip any seats in their favor anywhere across the country, with Nevada potentially being one. But even still, if we manage to flip Nevada, Joe Lombardo looks like it's very possible he could win. He's a 3.1% lead with 90% reporting. So it's actually at this point likely that he will unseat the incumbent Sisolak, which I think is great because Sisolak is literally a mobster. I'm not even kidding. Look it up. He does have ties to the mob down in Las Vegas. But nonetheless, if he ends up being elected there, and then we have a Republican elected in Alaska as well, then what we actually have here is 26 for the Republicans and then 24 for the Democrats. You may notice, though, this says 23. So Arizona is also currently up for grabs. Arizona, with 82% reporting, has the Democrat Katie Hobbs currently leading. And that would end up being a third flipped seat for the Democrats. It was Republican Doug Ducey. Actually, hang on. Let me double check my facts here. Yeah, it was Republican Doug Ducey, who is currently the head of the state of Arizona. So if Kari Lake ends up losing, that'll actually be a third seat that is flipped in favor of the in favor of the Democrats, with one seat, Nevada, being flipped in favor of Republicans. Do the math, 3 minus 1 is 2. So not only is there no red wave, not only is there no red ripple, but there isn't even any neutrality. The Democrats actually have two more in this scenario, which again is the scenario I think will happen, two more Democratic governors than they had in 2022. So the Senate does not have any sort of a red wave. And the gubernatorial election not only doesn't have a red wave, but actually has a blue ripple, right? And then the only thing that ends up working in the Republicans' favor at that point is the U.S. House of Representatives, where they need at least 7 more wins in order to get a 218 majority. And it looks like that will probably happen. You can kind of see a lot of the different areas here where they could win. Obviously, there's this big region here in Colorado. That's 1. This is 2. I think the red that you see here in California is 5, if I am remembering correctly. Let's go ahead and click on that, actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5. And then you got this one here in Oregon, which would put you at 8. That'd give you 219. And then there's various other places here, a couple in New York. But nonetheless, it does look like we could see the Republicans hit somewhere around 219, 220 in the House. So you would have, if my calculations are correct, and obviously I wouldn't be predicting them if I thought they weren't correct, you'll probably end with about 220, 222 Republicans in the House. That would be a red ripple, not a red wave. You can actually see here gained 7 seats. That's not very much. You get a majority, but barely. Then you would go to the Democrats, or excuse me, to the Senate, where Pennsylvania went to the Democrats, Nevada went to the Republicans, and you stay a solid 50-50, neutral, not a red wave, or a red ripple. And then you go to the governors, where you have 3 flipped for Democrats, 1 flipped for Republican, which means 2 more Democrat than Republican. You actually have a blue ripple. So not only did the red wave not happen, but the Republicans actually lost this election as far as any reasonable metric is concerned. They were supposed to take back all 3 positions. They actually already had a majority of governors. It was 28-22. They were supposed to have all 3 of these elections as far as gross total in the bag. They ended up being identical on one, losing on another, and barely eking out the third, which happens to be the House of Representatives, which is the easiest one for anybody to win. Okay. So, what's the takeaway from that? I know a lot of people want to say, oh, well, Democrats cheated. And a lot of people want to say this, that, and the third about, terrible candidates. And there's some truth to the second part of that. I don't think, as far as the Democrats cheating, I wouldn't put it past them, especially in the state of Arizona. But I don't think that that was really a significant problem in this particular election. Um, I do think the GOP putting forward some awful candidates certainly hurt them, no doubt. Mehmet Oz and Herschel Walker are two of the worst. Um, two of the worst candidates the Republican Party has put forward, at least in my lifetime. Absolutely awful. Mehmet Oz is basically a Democrat. He was literally pro-transgender, pro-abortion, pro-homosexuality, anti-gun, pro-global warming legislation, pro-COVID legislation, pro-Fauci, all this other kind of stuff until like 2 years ago, when all of a sudden he became a Trump friend and then decided to seek the Republican Party nomination for Pennsylvania. So I don't understand why he was even considered for the Pennsylvania senatorial nomination. And then Herschel Walker, like I pointed out, is just a genuinely detestable human being. He's terrible. He's not, on top of being mentally ill, which we don't want anybody who's mentally ill in any public office. He's also a deadbeat dad. He's an adulterer and a womanizer. He's a wife beater. He's somebody who refused to acknowledge his children. He's somebody who's paid to basically carry out a hit on his child. If we believe that abortion is murder, and fun fact, unlike most people in the conservative movement, I do. And I know a lot of you guys here in my audience do as well, because that's why you're listening to this, isn't it? So we do. Well, Herschel Walker paid for his mistress to get an abortion. So essentially, he hired a hitman to kill his own child, right? And again, I have no idea what the Republicans were thinking putting forward any of these two candidates. And of course, there's other people you could talk about as well, but it's not all that, right? For example, Doug Mastriano, who was the Republican Party nomination for governor of Pennsylvania, is somebody I have a great deal of respect for, actually. Huge deal of respect for. He's solid on the abortion issue. He's solid on the stealing of the election issue, solid on the COVID-19 issue. He's a veteran, solid on the illegal immigration question, solid on the climate change question. There was a lot of things to like about Doug Mastriano, and he lost. Now, he lost because a lot of people see him as a radical, which we're going to get to that in a moment, because that's, I think, the more important thing to take away here. But nonetheless, he was a good candidate. He's somebody who I would have proudly voted for if I was a Pennsylvania resident. Now, I'm not, of course, but nonetheless, somebody who I think was certainly worth our while. And again, he lost. So it's not just the fact that we put forward some terrible candidates, although the Republican Party certainly did put forward some terrible candidates. So then what's the other part of it? Well, I think it's time, friends. In fact, it's high past time. Here on this show, you guys who have been longtime listeners know I've been talking about this since the beginning of this program, which, if you've been with me since the Facebook days, was back in 2016. If you've been with me only since I've been on YouTube, it started in 2019. But I digress. I've been talking about for quite some time. We have simply lost the culture war. That's really the issue here, right? It is, everybody sits there and says, "Oh, well, with the transgender issue and things like drag queen story hour and stuff like that, right? With the issue of abortion being, so egregious, and people actually wanting to murder their children at such a grossly extravagant rate, and with the high inflation, and with the COVID-19 lockdowns, and with all this kind of stuff, we just expected that common sense would come into play, and that people would start to see the light and vote Republican. But I am here to tell you it is quite possible, and in fact, the case, in my opinion, that the American people just prefer this kind of stuff. Maybe they really are liberal. Maybe we are actually living in a post rational world, a post reason world, a post logic world, a post common sense world. And again, for those of you who've been watching the show for quite some time, you know this has been my position all along, right? I've never had faith in the American voter. I don't see any reason why I should tell you you should have faith in the American voter. The fact of the matter is, the American people, by and large, want abortion on demand. The American people, by and large, want drag queen story hour. The American people, by and large, want COVID-19 lockdowns. They want climate change legislation. They want illegal immigration to run rampant. They don't care about crime. They don't care about inflation. They don't care about gas prices and food prices. This is just the world we live in. And until we come to terms with the fact that the culture war has been lost for a while now, it's not like it was just lost in 2022, friends. It has been lost for quite some time. In fact, one could argue that it was lost well before 2015. If it wasn't lost before 2015, there never would have been a Bergefell versus Hodges, which is the Supreme Court ruling that struck down people's or individual states, excuse me, gay marriage laws. For those of you who don't actually remember, we've lost this culture war a while ago, maybe a decade or 2 decades ago. And we've just been hanging on to the idea that there's still a fighting chance, there's still hope. And I'm here to tell you, friends, there's not. There's really not. Now, does that mean revival can't happen? Things ebb and flow. It's totally possible that we could see a return to conservatism in this country. I, for one, believe that that is definitely not going to happen until we have a revival of the church. We are one nation under God. And if we are not under God, then we are no longer one nation. In fact, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who once said that if a sparrow cannot fall without his knowing, how can an empire rise up without without the watchful eye of the omnipotent God? I don't know exactly how he said it. Maybe I should pull up that quote for you guys. Um, but nonetheless, and John Adams, of course, had famously said that our Constitution was solely for a religious and moral people. It is wholly unfit for any other. And I just pulled up the Benjamin Franklin quote here. Let me read it to you. Gentlemen, I have lived a long time, and I am convinced that God governs in the affairs of men. If a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? I move that prayer, imploring the assistance of heaven be held every morning before we proceed to business. By the way, Benjamin Franklin, a lot of people will tell you, was an atheist. Considering the quote I just read, that's definitely not the case, right? He wasn't a Orthodox Christian by any stretch. He was really more of a deist, but a Christian deist, not your typical modern day deist, and one who was thoroughly entrenched in Protestant Puritan values. But at any rate, I digress. I think the Republican Party and conservatives outside of the Republican Party and within the Republican Party need to come to terms with the fact that we are living in a post-rational world, that we are living in clown world, as Doug Wilson likes to call it, and it'll probably only get worse from here. Does that mean we give up? No. I believe it is your civic duty to vote. I believe it is our duty as men to be defending our country. That includes our country's values, and it includes from threats within, which we would typically defend via politics, not via fighting, in case anybody's curious. It doesn't mean we give up, but I do think that we are living in a post-rational world, and I think the only way we're going to see conservative revival is if we first see Christian revival. And I'm not sure that that sort of thing is going to happen. Hopefully it does. It's certainly possible. If one looks throughout the Bible, or really just throughout history for that matter, one will find ebbs and flows, right? Things go up, things go down. Religiosity goes up, religiosity goes down. Obviously, there was the Great Awakening during a time of rampant godlessness back in the 17th century. Yeah, the 17th century, there was rampant godlessness. This isn't a new thing, right? Um, but it's entirely possible that it could be a very long time until that happens. And that's the bigger problem than anything else here. That's a bigger problem than Trump versus DeSantis, which frankly I don't care about. I don't trust either of them. That's a bigger problem than putting forward bad candidates, which in some instances, like Walker and like Oz, was true, but in cases like Mastriano was not true. That's a bigger issue than Democrats cheating, which I don't even deny happens. The bigger issue, the biggest issue at play here is that the American people want this to happen. They have lost the plot. We are living in a post-rational world, and we need to learn to accept that. We need to learn to understand, while still being patriots, while still looking to God as our only foundation, while still holding firm in the faith, holding firm in our American values, holding firm in our traditional values. We need to just recognize that we are currently pilgrims. Okay, this land is going down the tubes. And the reason it's going down the tubes is not because the institutions are so corrupt. It is because the people are corrupt. They have fallen. And again, I say to you, friends, we are living in a post-rational world. Book it, because it's the facts. It is the facts. Hopefully we see the Republicans take back the House. That would be nice. Hopefully we see us at least get to 50 Republican senators, with Laxalt going into the Congress and flipping Nevada. Hopefully these things occur. But if they don't occur, know that you heard it here first. And even if they do occur, know that you heard it here first. We are in a post-rational world. With all of that being said, I'm going to take a brief break, and we're going to come back and talk about some of the stuff that's going on in Israel. Actually, before we do that, I want to go ahead and demonstrate my point by way of a referendum that made me want to vomit all over myself. Not because of the referendum itself, but because of the vote that actually happened in the referendum itself. So let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. All right. So here you can see, and I'll zoom in to make sure you can see. Here you can see the election results of Montana referendum number 131. Now, Montana is supposed to be a red state. Montana, both of its representative seats went to the Republicans. In the United States Senate, they didn't actually have an election this year, but I believe both of their senators are Republicans. And though they didn't have a gubernatorial election this year, I believe their governor as well is a Republican. I will make sure to double check on that so that I can make sure I'm giving you guys the right information. However, they did have, like every other state, like most other states, two representative elections this year. Both of them went Republican. It is considered flyover country by the liberals. It is considered to be one of the redder states in the Union. So this is not California. Excuse me, right? It's not New York. It's not Illinois. It's not Vermont. It's not even Louisiana and Florida or Colorado, or states that are considered purple, Arizona, so on, right? This is red state, Montana. And by the way, I've just double checked. Their governor is a Republican, as is their lieutenant governor. The Montana state legislature in both houses is majority Republican, but they do have one Democratic senator, John Tester. Steve Daines, their other senator, is a Republican. So, but for the most part, what we were saying here reigns true. This is one of the states that is as red can be, right? And if you look here on your screen, you will see that they had a referendum put forward to their people, Montana referendum number 131, requires medical care for infants who are born alive. I'm going to say that again. Montana referendum number 131 requires medical care for infants who are born alive. Again, requires medical care to be provided to infants who are born alive, including after an attempted abortion. This is red state Montana. So this should have won, right? Even if it lost, it definitely shouldn't have lost by upwards of 5 percentage points, right? I'm sorry, friends, wrong. You can see it on your screen right now. Montana referendum number 131 requires medical care for infants born alive. 52.6%, 231,729 Montanans voted no. They voted no. Montana referendum number 131, the people of Montana voted no. A doctor should not be required to give medical care to an infant who is born alive in red state Montana, in a state whose legislature, both in total and in both houses, is dominated by Republicans, whose House Majority Leader, Speaker of House, Senate Majority Leader, President pro tempore, President of the Senate, Lieutenant Governor, Governor, both representatives, and one of their senators are all Republicans, in a state which has voted Republican in every election in the past, I think, 30 years, and they voted no. A doctor should not be required to give medical care to infants born alive. Notice the language here, including after an attempted abortion. That means not exclusively after an attempted abortion. So this wasn't just simply saying if you botched an abortion and the person who ended up coming out of the mother's womb ended up living, you have to give them medical care. No, it was just saying you have to give medical care to infants born alive, period. Including, meaning not exclusively, after an attempted abortion. Montana voted no. It lost by over 5%, 5.2% to be exact. 22,000 more Montanans decided to make Sodom look good than decided that they wanted to protect the life of, at this case, in this case, the born, not the unborn, the born. Failed by 22,509 votes, friends. Now you tell me, is this because Democrats cheated? Is this because the Republicans put forward poor candidates? Or is this because the American people have lost the plot? I think you know what it is. I think you know in the pit of your soul what it is. You may not want to admit it. You may want to say to yourself, this is the great country I grew up in. The thing is, it's not. It's simply not. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in Sodom. We are living in Gomorrah. The Reverend William Branham once said, and the Reverend Billy Graham repeated it, if God does not judge the United States of America, he will have to raise Sodom and Gomorrah from the ashes and apologize. And of course, they weren't actually trying to say that God has to apologize to anybody. Their point was simply to say, we are far past judgment time. And that was 50 years ago. Ain't no way Billy Graham and William Branham and anyone else saw this coming. I can tell you that for sure. This is the world we live in, friends. All right, we're going to take a brief break. We'll be back in about, give or take, a minute or so. And when we do come back, we'll be talking about Israel's election, as well as, some stuff going on the G20 religious forum summit. Hope you guys are back with us when we come back from our break. And yeah, we'll be right back. All right, friends, welcome back. We took a brief break here, and we are now back to the second hour of our discussion. I should probably have some kind of music or something like that to make it a little bit easier when I go on breaks there. But nonetheless, we have returned to the program, and we are now going to be moving into a discussion about Israel's election, as well as talking about some of the stuff going on at the G20 Religion Forum, and we're going to go ahead and just jump right in. So, for those of you who do not know, Netanyahu has made a remarkable political comeback in the country of Israel. Has made a remarkable political comeback in the country of Israel. He will likely be the prime minister of Israel yet again. Israel just had their sixth election in about 2.5 years. He had been voted out, and a coalition government that's only real uniting factor was we don't like Netanyahu has now been removed after something like 6 or 8 months as the government there. And there's going to be some interesting developments in Israel as a result of Netanyahu taking power back. Interesting things to come for Israeli nationalists. I should actually be more specific because really any Zionist is an Israeli nationalist, right? For hardcore Jewish supremacists getting positions of power, which in turn will have a huge impact on Gentile Christians, as well as more specifically Messianic Jews and Karaite Jews. Also, it will probably have a major impact on things like annexation of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria going forward. Also, it will probably have a major impact on things like Israeli US relations, considering we currently have a Democratic led Congress and a Democratic president. Also, it is probably going to have a lot of meaning in regards to, or a lot of impact in regards to the blossoming relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So this is going to be a very impactful election, of course, assuming that a government doesn't end up falling apart immediately like the previous five did, which is literally not an exaggeration. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and talk about this here a little bit. Got a couple interesting articles that we're going to read here. This is from Yahoo News. A stunning political comeback for Israel's Netanyahu may give way to governing nightmare ahead. Again, the article is titled A Stunning Political Comeback for Israel's Netanyahu May Give Way to Governing Nightmare Ahead. 1 second. And again, this is written by Yahoo News. Let me see if I can find the name of the author of this article. Yeah, it's right here, actually. Guy Ziv, Associate Professor, American University School of International Service. I was literally looking right at it, and I missed it. My apologies, friends. And like I said, this election is going to have probably a pretty massive impact on a lot of incredibly important things within the nation state of Israel. First off, the only way for Netanyahu to establish his government was for him to make some compromises with certain incredibly far-right political parties. This will probably lead to, for example, Ithamar Ben Gvir becoming a minister there in Israel. He is a well-known Kahanist and is somebody who, while I have a lot of admiration for Meir Kahane, I also recognize that his followers, on top of not necessarily following a lot of the things that he had said, such as never starting Jew-on-Jew violence, they also have taken some of the things he did say to what could only be described as their logical conclusion in the form of persecution of Messianic Jews and Karaite Jews. So, that's I think going to be an incredibly big deal. Also, as we look forward to, and I don't mean this in a positive way, but I think it's going to happen. I've said numerous times, I think it's going to happen. As we look forward to the possibility of a partition of Israel, with Judea and Samaria becoming Palestine, Israel proper being recognized by the world's different countries, most of which do not recognize it, Jerusalem being partitioned 3 ways, with West Jerusalem being capital of Israel, East Jerusalem being capital of Palestine, and the Old City being internationalized, likely taken over by either the United Nations or some international religious body, possibly even the Vatican. Um, as we look for these things coming down the pipe, it's very possible that this could not only facilitate those, but could also facilitate other things that would be related to those certain partitions and stuff like that. For example, I have said numerous times on this program, and will continue to say, that I think there's going to be a third temple built in Israel very soon. I think it'll probably end up being parallel with the Dome of the Rock, which has been the plan for quite some time. We're talking over a decade at this point. I believe that it'll probably be facilitated by the Vatican in Rome, as well as other multinational religious bodies such as the World Alliance of Religions for Peace, the World Evangelical Coalition, the World Council of Churches, and so on and so forth. I think that we will probably see it um, as become sort of a symbol of peace between Abrahamic religions. I think the World Economic Forum will probably have a good deal to do with it. And I think that the Vatican will play an interesting mediator role between whatever possible multinational religious organization could join this and the United Nations, because of the Vatican's incredibly unique position as both a church and a country. Um, and that's not even to talk about some of the other stuff I've already mentioned, such as a relationship with Saudi Arabia, which of course would go a very long way into partitioning Jerusalem, into partitioning the land of Israel into Israel and Palestine, into setting up a temple parallel with the Dome of the Rock, into having quote unquote peace between not only just Abrahamic religions, but likely many more. And all these things will be incredibly important. And I don't think these things could happen unless the kind of coalition that we're seeing be set up was set up, right? And so that's why I think this news is incredibly important. So let's go ahead and read here. Um, Israel's political magician has done it again. Having been turned out of office in 2021 as the first sitting Israeli prime minister to be indicted, and with his corruption trial still underway, Benjamin Netanyahu has made another stunning comeback. After four inconclusive elections in just 4 years, I guess I said this was the sixth earlier, so my apologies. It turns out it is the fifth, but nonetheless, after four inconclusive elections in just 4 years, a fifth national vote on November 1st, 2022, saw Israelis hand, excuse me, ugh, saw Israelis hand Netanyahu's right-wing bloc a decisive victory. In some ways, it shouldn't come as a big surprise. Netanyahu has been defying the political obituary writers, for years. He did so after his re-election defeat in 1999, then again following a humiliating loss in the 2006 elections. Now, the pundits who declared Netanyahu's career over after he lost the premiership last year to political rivals Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid have been proved wrong yet again. Netanyahu's win means the deadlock that has paralyzed Israel for nearly 4 years may finally be over, given his now 64-seat majority. But that doesn't mean his troubles will be over, far from it. As a scholar of Israeli politics, I believe a governing nightmare awaits Israel's longest-serving prime minister, and he's going to continue to go into some of the details here. Now, real quickly, it is important for us to mention that Benjamin Netanyahu is, in many ways, a good politician for Israel, um, though he certainly is not without his flaws, many of which we've kind of already referenced in the form of his uh, willingness to set up a coalition government with ultra nationalists and ultra orthodox people within his government or within his country, as well as his willingness to rely upon outside religious bodies, international organizations, and countries such as the United States. And also, on top of all that, he's got some pretty serious corruption charges against him. Appears to have not only taken bribes, but also bribed people himself. So he's certainly not without his flaws. But we continue. Netanyahu is set to form the most right-wing and religious government in Israel's history. And in ways that is positive, right? And this is again pausing here. There are and there are positives to that, right? Unfortunately, the big issues that we would have right now with Israel's government don't have so much to do with a lot of their more standard policies. In fact, for me personally, I am a strong Zionist and I'm highly influenced by the late Rabbi Mark Kahana. I believe, for example, that Judea and Samaria, commonly called in the media the West Bank, is the property of the Jewish people. I don't believe there's any such thing as Palestine. I believe it's just they're essentially Jordanian Arabs. They have no right to the land, in my opinion. Jerusalem, I believe, is the undivided capital of the Jewish people. Um, I think it's ridiculous that they're not allowed to ascend the Temple Mount to pray, considering it's their holiest site. And people want to say, well, it's the third holiest site in Islam. Yeah, okay, so let me blow up Mecca and then put the third holiest synagogue in the whole Jewish religion there, and tell me how insulting you think that is, right? And even in regards to a lot of their laws being based off of Torah Judaism, I don't really have a problem with that. Even where my issues come in with some of these more religious right wing people in Israel is number one, they seem to be incredibly hostile towards Gentile Christians and in some instances towards Gentiles at all, which I don't appreciate. Number two, they seem to be highly persecutory towards Jews who don't see eye to eye with them religiously. For example, many of them would say Messianic Jews and Karaite Jews aren't even Jews at all. And for those who don't know what those are, Messianic Jews are Jews who are Christians, such as myself, and Karaite Jews are Jews who only believe the Tanakh, or what we would call the Old Testament, is binding, inspired religious text, as opposed to, for example, the Talmud or Mishnahs or things like that, which most Orthodox, Reform, and conservative Jews would also accept. And a lot of your more rigid ultra Orthodox Jews would say that Karaites and Messianics aren't Jews at all, and therefore don't have any actual right to return, don't have any national rights under the Israeli basic laws, and so on and so forth. Things which really, I think you could preempt them by establishing an Israeli constitution that recognized not only these groups, but other Jewish groups as well as citizens who are entitled to their, in this case, would be constitutionally enshrined rights. But unfortunately, there is no constitution in Israel. The closest thing they have is the basic laws of Israel, which are not quite as set in stone as a constitution, right? But I digress. Also, and another one of the big issues I would have with them, as I've already said, is their willingness to compromise on issues regarding the establishment of a Temple Mount perpendicular of not perpendicular, I think, sorry, parallel of the Dome of the Rock, or their willingness to accept these multi-religious unions between Muslims and Jews and Christians and stuff like that. So, it's an interesting thing, at least for me personally, because I agree with a lot of what the ultra Orthodox and ultra nationalist people in Israel would say, with some minor twerks, or excuse me, that's not the right word. My apologies. Minor quirks there that in the end turn out to be not so minor when one considers the high levels of persecution that Gentiles, Karaite Jews, Messianic Jews could end up being put under, as well as, of course, the incredibly negative effects on, our pushes away from globalism that would that would end up coming to fruition as a result of them building a temple and stuff like that. But at any rate, I'm rambling. His right-wing Likud party will rule in a coalition with ultra-nationalist and ultra-Orthodox partners. The radical agenda of one of these parties, the far-right religious Zionist party, includes the unfettered expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which I have no problem with, which it seeks to annex, which again I have no problem with. In fact, like I said, the West Bank, which actually I refuse to call it the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. It belongs to the Jewish people, so that would not be one of my issues with them. Enabling soldiers to shoot at Palestinian assailants without proper authorization from their superiors. Again, I have no issue with that. Expelling disloyal Arab citizens from their homes in Israel. Again, would not have any issue with that. And allowing Jewish prayer at the Temple Mount. Again, I would have no issue with that. An act seen by Muslims as a provocation, given the arrangement that for decades has permitted Jews to visit but not to pray at their Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which I think is completely absurd. Again, the issues I actually would have with these people is persecution of Gentiles, persecution of Karaite Jews, persecution of Messianic Jews, and the setup of a temple parallel to the Dome of the Rock. Those would be my concerns with these religious governments. I don't have a problem with them expelling non-Jews who are disloyal to the country. I think that that's obvious. I don't have a problem with the annexation of Judea and Samaria. I think that that's obvious. I don't have a problem with allowing Jews to pray at the Temple Mount. That should be, again, obvious. And so, the things that this article is going to have a problem with are not things that I am personally going to have a problem with. Though, again, I want to be clear, there are issues to be had with the ultra nationalists in the nation of Israel. One second. All right. The party is also deeply conservative on social issues, calling for a rollback of gay rights by banning or, for example, the Jerusalem Pride Parade, which I don't necessarily take issue with that either. Not only are such policies alarming to the international community and to many Israelis and Palestinians, they also promise to give Netanyahu endless headaches in his next term in office. Although he has been Israel's leading right-wing politician, Netanyahu does not share the far-right religious ideology of some of his new political allies. In my 2014 book, Why Hawks Become Doves, I quote an ex-top aide to former prime ministers and Netanyahu's rivals, Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert, as saying that while Netanyahu surrounds himself with rightist kind of guys, he is the most liberal guy in this group, which is part of the danger in a way, because he ends up relying too heavily on international organizations and foreign countries. In fact, I've kind of said on here before, and I think it's very true, that the nation of Israel is in many ways the 51st state of the country, right? Because we end up giving them so much money. They have to ask us before they can actually do certain things. One of the more famous examples of this is when they attacked Iran in 1981, and Ronald Reagan ended up going after them saying, hey, you can't do that. And they ended up pulling back because Daddy Washington spoke and they said we can't do that. So, and this is I think one of the bigger issues with Netanyahu and with the whole nation of Israel in general, but I digress. To be sure, Netanyahu has a conservative worldview, yet he is also a secular, pragmatic, and risk-averse politician. His flexibility has been displayed on numerous occasions over the years. In his first term, he continued the Oslo peace process he had fiercely criticized as leader of the opposition, signing the Hebron Protocol and the White River Memorandum that led to Israeli withdrawal from territories in the West Bank, which again is more properly referred to as Judea and Samaria. He voted 3 times for the 2005 unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip, before then resigning in opposition to the withdrawal. And in June 2009, he abandoned his lifelong opposition to a Palestinian state by publicly endorsing the two-state solution. Again, he later reversed this position. Netanyahu also acceded to President Barack Obama's demand in 2009 for a 10-month freeze in Jewish settlement construction to restart peace talks, negotiations that ultimately collapsed on his watch, which, as you can see, there's a trend here of him speaking out of both ends of his mouth. And one of the things that this article is not going to bring up is the fact that he was also instrumental, along with former President of the United States, Donald Trump, he was also, these two were also instrumental in bringing forward the Abraham Accords, where Israel signed peace deals um, with numerous, political, Arab political leaders. My apologies. I'm getting a little tired here, so I should probably do the rest of this quite quickly because I'm starting to ramble. Likewise, in the past, Netanyahu attempted to piece together broad based coalitions with centrist components to mitigate the influence of extremists. But with pro and anti Netanyahu blocs now firmly entrenched in Israeli politics, Netanyahu has no real choice but to form an ideologically narrow far right coalition. Man, tea is God's gift to man, or at least one of the thousands, because he has given us many gifts. But I digress. I say that too much. Got to turn that into a shirt or something. Indeed, the emergence of the extreme right that he now courts is a monster largely of Netanyahu's own creation. As Israeli society has drifted to the right, becoming more religious and conservative, which is in many ways good, although of course Judaism rejects Jesus Christ as the Messiah, so in many ways it's also not good. Judaism is, as much as we don't like to admit it, especially me as a Jew, Judaism is as anti-Christian, anti-Christ, anti-God as Islam is, as Catholicism is, as Mormonism is. But anyway, as Israeli society has drifted to the right, becoming more religious and conservative, Netanyahu has increasingly stoked discord between the right and the left to expand his base. Netanyahu himself has ridden the wave of populist nationalism in his country over the last decade. He and his loyalists portrayed critics, be they members of the media, former senior members of the security establishment, political centrists, and even fellow conservative supporters turned rivals, as leftists and out of touch elites, which is largely true. It's actually not even too far. It's not even too far off of the truth, to be honest with you. On the world stage, he befriended populist nationalist leaders such as Russia's Vladimir Putin, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Brazil's, I don't really know how to say this name, I'm sorry, but I believe it is, I don't even know, Jair Bolsonaro. I don't know how to pronounce Portuguese, I'm sorry, and former President Donald Trump. He adopted much of Trump's rhetoric too, blaming a leftist witch hunt for the investigation into his alleged corruption, bribery, and fraud. Similarly, he labeled the government that replaced him a year ago as a dangerous left wing coalition that came to power via the greatest election fraud in the country's history. Like these other populist leaders, Netanyahu has cultivated a political alliance with ultra nationalist figures. The most controversial figure is the emerging coalition, or in the emerging coalition, is Itamar Ben Gvir, a disciple of the late Rabbi Meir Kahane, may he rest in peace, an ultra-nationalist politician whose racist Koch party was ultimately outlawed in Israel. And for the record, I must defend the Rabbi Kahane. The Koch party was not racist. The Koch party was simply very Israeli nationalist, but they certainly were not racist. They were accused of being racist because he wanted to basically create a policy where Gentiles would either have to remain in Israel as resident strangers, which would mean they would have all of their personal rights but no political ones, which is just a fancy way of saying you would still have your right to bear arms, you would still have your right to worship as you see fit, freedom of speech, all these kinds of things, trial by jury, right? The rights you would not possess would be right to stand for public office or right to vote for people who are running in public office, which personally I don't have any issue with that at all. I don't think that people who are not citizens of your country should have a right to vote in your country. The other thing that caused him to be considered racist is he said that those who do not want to accept status as resident strangers in the country should be deported. And again, I don't have any issue with that at all. To me, those two things sound perfectly obvious, and I would recommend similar things here in the United States. If you're not a citizen, you don't get citizens' rights. Obviously, in our country, we have a civic nationalism rather than a ethno-nationalism. So in this instance, it wouldn't be because you're a certain ethnicity; it would be because you're born here, right, or because you've gone through the process of becoming a citizen. But nonetheless, you can live here as a non-citizen, right, a resident stranger, so to speak. But you shouldn't have any citizens' rights, which is not your personal rights, right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those kinds of things, but rather would be rights like standing for public office, running an election, those kinds excuse me, standing for public office for an election, the same thing, voting in an election, and those kinds of things, right? And also, if you are a foreign national who does not want to accept that status, you should not live here. You should be deported. I mean, it sounds to me those things are just perfectly rational. So I will defend Kahana in a lot of ways. There are issues Kahana had, but there are some of the issues I've already brought up, right? Things like his kind of anti-Messianic Jewish rhetoric, anti-Karaite rhetoric. Um, Things which I ultimately think people like Ben Gavir actually have taken farther than Kahana ever did. Kahana was quite clear that Jew on Jew violence was a big no no. It was forbidden. And in fact, he had said numerous times that he would never want to use the state to force Jews to do anything, nor would he want to do anything outside of their basic things like not committing crimes, right? And that also he would never put his weight behind anybody who would commit terrorist acts against fellow Jews or start civil war or something like that, which would ultimately mean when it comes to issues like Karaites and Messianics, as long as they were recognized as Jews, which Kahana did recognize them as Jews, um, their persecutions would not be well, they wouldn't be, right? He'd have Karaite, anti-Messianic rhetoric, but I don't think he would be persecuting them and doing violence to them and things like that, like people like Ben Gavir would. Um, Although, perhaps there would be something else you might want to do there because of the anti-Messianic rhetoric and stuff like that. It'd be an interesting thing to look into. But again, I think that Ben Gavir and others have taken it far more, have taken everything far more extreme, too far of a greater extreme, I should say, than Kahana ever did. And I don't think Kahana would ever have endorsed violence against fellow Jews. But at any rate, Ben Gavir once proudly hung a picture in his living room of Baruch Goldstein, the Jewish terrorist who in 1994 murdered 29 Muslims in a Hebron mosque. Until recently, Ben Gavir was a fringe figure in Israeli politics. However, in 2019, Netanyahu, seeking to shore up his right-wing bloc, orchestrated a merger between two far-right parties, Ben Gavir's Jewish Power and Yamina, led by Bezalel Smotrich. The new party, the Religious Zionists, which also included, let me scroll down here, which also included, excuse me, man, I'm getting too tired. I got to get through this quickly. I apologize. Which also included the ultra-conservative Noam faction, ensured that far-right representatives were able to cross the electoral threshold and make it into the Knesset, Israel's parliament. The Religious Zionists received 6 seats in the Knesset in the 2021 election, and then jumped to 14 seats in the recent election. That makes it the third largest party in the new Knesset and the second largest party in the coalition Netanyahu is seeking to build. Driven by his political survival instincts, in other words, Netanyahu ensured the right-wing votes would not be lost by failing to reach the threshold needed for representation. In doing so, he also legitimized Ben Gavir's extremist party and helped make it mainstream practically overnight. A challenge too far? As a harbinger of potential discord, Netanyahu has already indicated that his government will not alter the status quo regarding LGBTQ rights to accommodate to the homophobic agenda of the religious Zionists. That is the words of the article, not my words. Given past precedent, I believe it is also likely that he upholds the status quo on the Temple Mount by preventing Jews from praying there, the position that he has abided by in the past, which is, in my opinion, the wrong position. Again, the issues which these guys have are not the true issues with Ben Gavir. What Ben Gavir believes about homosexual marriage is no different than what most Republicans here in America believe about homosexual marriage, although we might be a little more libertarian than him. Also, what he believes about the Temple Mount is not only not extreme, it's just basic common sense, really. Again, the actual issues that should be addressed as it pertains to Ben Gavir are issues of the recognizing and protecting of the rights of Karaite and Messianic Jews. Still, he may find it difficult to control the ascent of Jewish worshippers on the Temple Mount, a growing phenomenon in recent years. Topping the new coalition's priorities, however, is an issue from which Netanyahu stands to benefit personally, reforming the judiciary so that politicians, rather than unelected institutions, have greater control over key decisions, which of course is just a recipe for extreme corruption. The practical effects of such changes would be to weaken the authority of the courts and the attorney general. Passing legislation that would cancel Netanyahu's trial may also be in the cards, which again is incredibly corrupt. Last month, Netanyahu, interviewed by comedian Bill Maher, defended Israel as the one democracy in the Middle East. Netanyahu's preserving Israel's fragile democracy while pursuing his own political and personal interests may prove to be a colossal challenge, one that even a political magician like Netanyahu may find insurmountable. And of course, again, I feel the need to reemphasize that this article is not actually going after the right problems, right? The true problems with Ben Gvir are: is he going to try to up persecution of Gentiles? Is he going to fail to recognize Messianic Jews as Jews and therefore not give them their citizens' rights? Is he going to do the same with Karaite Jews? And is he planning on getting a temple built on the Temple Mount rather than just allowing Jews to ascend and pray? Those are the four big issues. All these other issues are things which I entirely agree with him on. And I think any rational Israeli citizen would also have to agree with him on. But I digress on that. Let's go ahead and move to our next article here very quick. Let me see. We've been going for an hour and 32 minutes. Probably go up to about 2 hours at this point. Let me get the next article shared. It's another one about Israel's elections. Just a moment as I pull it up. Sorry, having a brief issue finding this here. Don't know why it's not on my tabs. I can see it on my tabs, but there we go. All right, this is from the Council on Foreign Relations. Israel's election, what to think about religious Zionist Netanyahu and tales of doomsday. Excuse me. And again, we are almost done, friends. So I appreciate those of you who are still with us today. All right. Doomsday predictions about the consequences of Israel's elections are overwrought. Some of the proposed legal reforms would bring Israel's system closer to the U.S. model. So this is a little bit more of a positive look at Israel's elections. And again, like I've been kind of hampering on here, there is a lot of positive to be said. There's a striking parallel between the comments being heard from the left in the United States about the meaning of a possible Republican victory November 8th. This is, of course, something that did not end up happening, and from the left in the United States, as much or more than in Israel, about the meaning of the victory of the right in the Israeli election on November 1st. The meaning, we are told, is the end of democracy. That's what President Biden and Hillary Clinton said on November 2nd about our elections, and President Obama said democracy is on the ballot. It is what we heard from commenters such as Thomas Friedman about the Israeli results and our own election. He's saying our because this gentleman is from Israel. Domestic policies is not my subject here. Israel is. What actually happened? There was a very high turnout of voters, over 70%, substantially higher than is typical in the United States, and this was the 5th election in under 4 years, and it split almost down the middle. The parties on the right had only 30,000 more votes than the parties on the left, out of 4.7 million votes cast. The right, led by former Prime Minister Netanyahu, will have 64 seats in the Knesset, while the left will have 56, mostly because the right was well led, clever, and united, while the parties on the left and the Arab parties could not unite, and their divisions defeated them in Israel's complex system. The attacks on the outcome have several roots. One source is the mistrust and sometimes hatred of Netanyahu that's widely felt on the left, and is reflected in many newspaper columns here and in Israel, as it was especially in the Obama years. He's very much like Israel's version of Trump, in so much as the people of Israel find him to be an incredibly polarizing figure. But the strongest comments are about the religious Zionist Party, now the third largest with 14 Knesset seats, and its two leaders, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, uh, and about the extremist and anti-democratic programs they will impose. I will never consider voting for that party. This is again the writer of the article. I will never consider voting for that party or for either man, were I an Israeli, for several reasons, or were I an Israeli, excuse me, for several reasons that begin with the fact that I am neither conservative, that I am a conservative, excuse me, and neither of them is. Neither has shown any grasp of the reforms needed to make Israel a better governed and more prosperous country, in my view. They say little or nothing about the stifling, bureaucracy, which was one of Kahana's main points, by the way, and the need for economic reform, for example. They have also taken a variety of positions and, more significantly, sometimes used words or taken poses meant to be provocative and which were entirely irresponsible. But the critics on the left here have gone well over the line in their comments and predictions. For one thing, Netanyahu is known as a Netanyahu is a known quantity as prime minister because he was Israel's longest serving prime minister ever. His party is by far the largest in the coalition, and as his long record shows, he is as canny a politician as Israel has ever produced. Moreover, he has in the main been pretty prudent as a leader, avoiding war and conflict whenever possible and watching carefully where the voters are. It is not at all to be assumed that the government will be under the thumb of Ben-Gvir or Smotrich, who are new and untested as government officials, Moreover, though they joined to run in this election, they actually came from separate parties and may soon find themselves as rivals. If it is useful to Netanyahu to have this happen, he will let the wiles to encourage it. Or he has the wiles, to encourage it. My goodness, I am reading atrociously right now. A good example of what I mean is the fear repeatedly stated that Israel's widely admired policies towards LGBT citizens will change, which, to be honest with you, I wouldn't even necessarily have an issue with because, well, gay marriage is really gay mirage, as Doug Wilson says. I don't think that it should be illegal, but I don't think the state should recognize it. I think that does something, it's only really symbolic at that point. But I think that symbolism does mean something. Last week, the Times of Israel carried a story with this headline: slapping down far-right partners, Netanyahu vows no change to LGBT status quo. I suspect we will see more of this as the month passes. We do not really know what the balance of power will be issue by issue, nor can it be easily predicted. But here's one prediction shot down even before the new government has taken office. A better example is the accusation that Israel's legal system will be destroyed. To understand the story fully, read the excellent article in National Review last week by two leaders of Israel's Law and Liberty Forum. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Excuse me. By two leaders of Israel's Law and Liberty Forum, Ilana Meisel Diamond and Jonathan Green, entitled "Judicial Reform in Israel is Urgent and Necessary." As a general comment, the reforms being proposed on the right would actually make Israel's system look more like ours. I thought this man was from Israel. I guess I read that part wrong. Anyways, for instance, critics say it is outrageous that Israeli reformers propose ministers to be able to appoint their legal advisors. Today, those extremely powerful lawyers can overrule some ministerial decisions, yet are career bureaucrats whom the minister has no hand in selecting. But what the reformers on the right are proposing is precisely what we have in the United States and has never been considered an assault on democracy, that ministers appoint their own lawyers. Here, the president appoints cabinet secretaries and they select their general counsels. Will reforms destroy Israel's Supreme Court by allowing the Knesset to override its decisions? We do not permit this in the United States. When the U.S. Supreme Court declares a law unconstitutional, Congress can do nothing unless it is able to remove the party of the law ruled unacceptable and thereby save the rest. And only a constitutional amendment can change the outcome. But of course, we have a written constitution. Israel does not, which is one of the big problems, in my opinion. On what basis, then, does their Supreme Court overrule Knesset decisions? What standards can it possibly use? The reformers at the Law and Liberty Forum, which is supported by the Tikva Fund, whose board I chair, ask the same question, and their answer is that the judges simply make it up. They decide what the Constitution would sort of look like if they had one, and they decide which laws look okay and which do not. As Meisel Diamond and Green put it, the Israeli Supreme Court endowed itself with the power of judicial review of parliamentary legislation despite the absence of a duly ratified constitutional document. And the court departed from its own tradition of restraint to effectively eliminate any limitation on standing and subject matter jurisdiction in constitutional cases. These are just a few elements of a long and continuing appropriation of policymaking power by the judiciary, whose radical innovations have were lambasted, even by international legal thinkers such as Judge Richard Posner, over 15 years ago, end quote. What makes that system even worse is that while in our system the president appoints Supreme Court justices with the advice and consent of the Senate, thus involving elected organs of government, in Israel the judges have a powerful hand in selecting themselves. In Israel, judges are selected by a 9-member committee, of which 4 members represent the elected branches. 3 members are Supreme Court justices, and 2 represent the Bar Association. And because a candidate for the court needs 7 yes votes, the 3 members of the committee who are Supreme Court justices can block anyone they don't care to have as a new colleague. Reforming that system is not radical, and as noted, would bring Israel's system closer to that in many other countries, including the United States. Another reform would eliminate the crime of breach of trust, which in the Israeli system has been complained of for decades as overly vague. See the longer explanation by Meisel Diamond, and Green for details. But in my view, the issue there is retroactivity. The reform should not, in my view, be used to defeat the indictments of Netanyahu, and it may be. The larger question remains judicial review of legislation. Here we have a written constitution and we have judicial review. In other countries without a written constitution, including the United Kingdom, judicial review is more limited. In some countries, the federal or provincial parliaments can override certain judicial decisions, as in Canada. Meisel Diamond and Green urge, quote, the Israeli legal system is complicated and the details matter. Observers ought to reserve judgment when considering the value of existing arrangements and of proposals for reform, end quote. That's good advice. Judicial review in a system without a written constitution runs great risks of allowing unelected judges to enforce their political views, which is even a problem here in the United States, though certainly not as big of one. Were I making an argument for it, the argument would be this. In Israel, there is a 20% permanent minority, Arab Israelis, who cannot easily use the democratic system to protect their rights. And I don't think they should be a permanent minority either, but that's not actually here nor there. I do not suggest I know where the proper balance lies and which exact reforms Israel needs, and I am not an Israeli. But I do wish American critics would stop implying or even stating that every reform proposal means the end of Israeli democracy. The critique is especially rich coming from Americans on the left who have tried to intimidate our own Supreme Court justices, have supported court packing proposals because they do not like the outcomes in certain cases, or have sought to delegitimize the court and decisions they do not like. And of course, that's 100% true. For myself, I wish that the religious Zionist party were not in the governing coalition in Israel, and I hope Prime Minister Netanyahu will prevent them from imposing policies his previous government avoided. How long religious Zionism will be in government is uncertain, as is all Israeli politics. No one predicted 4 years ago that Israel would end up holding 5 elections in sequence to settle which coalition would lead, though one could certainly see the country moving on the right over the long term, or to the right over the long term, and more recently as a reaction to Palestinian violence in the West Bank and Hamas attacks from Gaza, as well as internal violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews in May 2021. How long the religious Zionist party itself, a coalition of 3 parties formed in 2021, will last is equally unclear. The recent election demonstrated once again how parties can rise and fall rapidly in Israeli elections. But I wish the doomsday predictions were suspended until we see what the policies of the new government actually are. Some of that criticism simply reflects the fact that a lot of people, perhaps including most American Jews, wanted the Lapid government to continue in power. Some of it reflects the political views of journalists who equally wanted the former coalition to continue. And some reflects genuine fear of statements Ben Gvir and Smotrich have made and positions they have espoused. But they are not prime ministers. Israel's toughest, wiliest, craftiest, and most experienced politician is, and he knows he presides over a nation whose electorate was split down the middle and which faces dangerous and even existential security threats. So let's hold off on the doomsday talk. Churchill once said, quote, politics is not a game, it is an earnest business, end quote. In Israel, as in most places, it is both. The new government will be sworn in a month or so, and we will see the balances of power within it shift over time and watch it take and modify positions. As it acts, there will be plenty of opportunity to acknowledge, applaud, protest, or condemn. To express certainty today as to what it all means, and what the government will do during the time that it exists is simply to express one's prejudices and one's politics. It's a bit like, well, like saying the American democracy will end if Republicans take the House on November the 8th. And I appreciate that he added that there because that is exactly correct. This is Elliot Abrams who wrote this. And again, my big issue when it comes to Ben-Gvir has little to do with what he believes about resident strangers, has little to do with what he believes about homosexuality, has little to do with what he believes about Jews praying on the Temple Mount, has everything to do with how he would treat Gentiles, Messianic Jews, and Karaites, provided he got more power. Persecution of those groups is, I think, a very real threat in Israel. And if they had a constitution which formally recognized, so that the rabbinate didn't have a choice in the matter, which formally recognized that Karaite Jews and Messianic Jews are indeed really Jews, I think that would solve a lot of the problems. Primarily because you wouldn't be allowed to persecute them or take away their citizens' rights. And for those of us who are Christians, who have a grave concern over whether or not Christians will be persecuted in the Holy Land, if Messianic Jews were guaranteed both their political and personal rights, that would mean that Christians, because they are Christians religiously, were guaranteed their political and personal rights in the state of Israel. And that would solve a lot of the problems. It would, in this case, it would only be Christian Jews, don't get me wrong, but we shouldn't have a problem with that, considering the fact that personal rights are not something that the state should be able to take away anyways, and that it is also something you could enshrine in a constitution. Personal rights cannot be removed from any group, Jewish or not, because that's not something that's predicated on you being a citizen, right? Anyways, we still have a couple more things to talk about here. We might not actually get to the G20 Religious Forum today, but that's okay, because we're already about to hit the 2-hour mark. But let's go ahead and talk about Israel's relations with Saudi Arabia, which are indeed growing. Normalizing, according to Netanyahu, first off, this is from Forward, which describes itself as Jewish, independent, and nonprofit. Netanyahu says normalizing Israeli-Saudi relations would end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Again, normalizing Israeli-Saudi relations would end the Arab-Israeli conflict. The next Israeli prime minister said an accord is in reach and would yield widespread peace, which is concerning not because we don't want peace, but because it is possible that the effects of this peace could be more than we are actually willing to pay. And by we, I don't mean Israelis, because I am not an Israeli, though I am a Jew. But the people of the world, basically, right? I don't think that the internationalization of Jerusalem would be good for anybody. I don't think the establishment of Palestine would be good for anybody. I don't think that the building of a third temple there would be good for anybody. I don't think that getting multinational bodies involved, like the UN or a possible world religious body, would be good for anybody. But reading ahead here. Incoming Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Wednesday that he believes a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is within reach and would effectively end the Arab-Israeli conflict. Netanyahu, speaking from Israel at an online event hosted by Temple Immanuel's Stryker Center, reminded an online audience of nearly 300 people that the Abraham Accords were negotiated by the administration of former President Donald Trump when he, namely Benjamin Netanyahu, was prime minister. And his referencing of those Abraham Accords is precisely part of the problem, in my opinion, right? Because when we look at these Abraham Accords, right, one of the things that we are seeing is a push towards greater religious unity between groups that basically just don't have any business. Um, excuse me, they just don't have any business being united. Is really the thing, right? Um, when it comes to, and I know everybody wants to say, hey, union between Israel and Palestine would be good, or union between Islam and Christianity would be good, and all these different things. And it sounds good to a lot of people. But the thing is, what that would entail, especially for those of us who are in the know, namely, we are Christians, namely, we know because we believe the scriptures where the world is going to go in the end times. Now, of course, at God's appointed time, things will happen, right? But it is entirely possible. I believe that there's this. Let me give some context. There's this argument in philosophy known as the idol argument, right? And the idol argument is basically a argument that says, hey, if everything is basically ordained by God, then whether or not you go to the doctor is irrelevant, because if you go to the doctor and you're not actually ordained to get better, then you would not have gotten better going to the doctor or not going to the doctor. And if you are ordained to get better, then you're going to get better regardless of if you go to the doctor or not, right? And the response to this idol argument has always been God ordains the ends as well as the means. Or, in other words, things can be co-fated with each other, right? It could be that you are fated to get better from your disease because you are fated to go to a doctor who has the cure, right? Or at least can treat you in such a way that you'll be cured, right? Similarly, I think, is it true that when God's appointed time comes, these things will take place? Yes, but it's also probably true that God's appointed time will be a time when people are willing to let this kind of stuff happen on their watch, right? Because one is co-fated with the other. God ordains the means as well as the ends. So, in this particular instance, when it comes to the establishment of a third temple, when it comes to the establishment of a multi-religious organization that unites Islam and Christianity and Catholicism and Mormonism and Judaism and all these things, that will only come to pass, in my view, when we, the people, are good and ready for it to come to pass. Not because God relies on us, but because God has co-fated us being good and ready with the establishment of a third temple and all those kinds of things. And I don't mean good and ready as in like, okay, God, we're ready, bring it down now. No, I mean that we would be deceived to such an extent that we think multinational religious organizations, multi-religious organizations, and establishing a third temple and these other sorts of things are good, right? Why do they call them so with that context, why do they call it the Abraham Accords? They call it the Abraham Accords because it's supposed to be the uniting of these two groups of people, namely Muslim Arabs and Jews, the uniting of these two groups of people under the banner of Father Abraham. And let's recall, March 5th, 2021, piggybacking off of the Abraham Accords, what did Pope Francis do? He called together a prayer for all the different religions who considered Abraham their patriarch. He called together a interreligious prayer or an interreligious meeting to have an interreligious prayer at the ziggurat at which is a pagan temple, right? He called together Mandaeans, called together Jews, called together Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, Mormons, etc., all the different religions who believe that Abraham is their patriarch. He called them to to have a meeting where they all shared a prayer with each other under the banner of Father Abraham, right? He would not have done that had he not been able to piggyback off of Donald Trump's Abraham Accords, which Netanyahu is now saying will be a catalyst for peace between him and the Islamic theocratic kingdom known as Saudi Arabia. Hope I'm making sense. Quote, it didn't happen without Saudi approval because those countries wanted to know what their big neighbor Saudi Arabia thought about it. I can assure you it wasn't negative, end quote. He added that as a prelude to the Abraham Accords, which normalize relations, between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, Saudi Arabia permitted aircraft to fly over its airspace while coming to and leaving Israel. Netanyahu, following his Likud party's success in last week's elections, is expected to lead the next Israeli government. Wednesday's online event, organized with the National JCC Literary Consortium and the Jewish National Fund USA, promoted his new memoir, Bibi, My Story. Considered the most influential country in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia has never recognized Israel, but both countries share a bitter enemy in Iran. Netanyahu on the campaign trail often spoke about improving relations with Saudi Arabia, and Biden's administration officials have said that the U.S. would support the process. At the same time, though the White House has adopted a tougher approach to Saudi Arabia for its manipulation of oil prices and the murder of American journalist Jamal Khashoggi, among other issues. And let's recall, it's not irrelevant that they have a common enemy in Iran, not only because that would lead them to become friendly with each other, but because that actually leads us into a greater conversation about a potential World War III. Remember that World War I was started because of a annoying and obnoxious entanglement of alliances. And what do we have today? An annoying and obnoxious entanglement of alliances. Israel is friends with the U.S., who is friends with Saudi Arabia, who now wants to be friends with Israel. Both have a problem with Iran, who's friends with Russia, also who's friends with China, who's friends with North Korea. You kind of get the point, right? And you can see developing these different sides that would end up, potentially coming to blows with each other. One side, your quote unquote allies or entente, if you will, in this scenario, would be the UK, probably the rest of Europe, although maybe not Eastern Europe. Canada, the United States, Israel, Japan, South Korea, etc. The other side, you have Iran, Russia, Brazil, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and etc. Again, also Pakistan and Afghanistan would probably be a big part of that. You get the idea. Netanyahu on Wednesday also said that in making peace with Saudi Arabia, given its stature in the Middle East, Israel will be effectively ending the Arab-Israeli conflict. Quote, we already had peace decades ago with Jordan and Egypt, end quote, he added. Quote, so yes, I think it's a worthy goal, end quote. Many Palestinians have critiqued the Abraham Accords for its failure to advance their cause, and in particular, the founding of a Palestinian state. That criticism is not something you should ignore because, mark my words, the establishment of a Palestinian state is going to be a prerequisite for the furthering of Jewish-Israeli relations, or excuse me, of Jewish-Arabian relations. And I believe, although I am not a prophet, I can't see the future, I have no crystal ball, but I believe I even know how that's going to come about. I think they're going to give Judea, Samaria, and Gaza to the Arabs to establish a nation of Palestine. I believe they will divide Israel three ways. East Jerusalem will be the capital of Palestine. West Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel. It'll be internationally recognized by people as the capital of Israel. And the Old City, which is, of course, the ancient part of Israel, will be internationalized and probably set up as the headquarters for some multinational religious organization. I think that is very likely going to happen. Netanyahu lashed out at Palestinian leadership Wednesday, saying the path to peace is not through them. It is, though. I hate to burst Netanyahu's bubble, but it absolutely is. The only way rejectionists can be overcome is by having a massive counterweight that would isolate them, and I believe that counterweight is going to be the Arab world, end quote. Commenting on the increase in anti-Semitism in the U.S. and elsewhere, Netanyahu encouraged American Jews to speak up forcefully, quote, you are fortunate to live in a great free country, and your voices can be heard, and you should make them heard, end quote. So, Israel and Saudi Arabia are, and by the way, Nanya Biz, I see you there. Thank you very much for being here. Israel and Saudi Arabia are becoming more and more friendly with each other. Will they ever formally recognize each other? Absolutely, they will. But there's going to have to be a couple of things that change in order for that to happen. One of those things is going to be the establishment of a Palestinian state with its capital in East Jerusalem. And in order for Israel to accept that, it needs to know that the international community will recognize its capital as West Jerusalem. Once those two things are set in play, which will probably logically include the middle portion of the city, the old city, being internationalized, then I think we will be able to see a level of true, well, quote unquote, true peace. We'll say recognized peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And it's not something that I think will last long, but I think it'll last at least long enough to accomplish these particular things, build a third temple, and maybe even set up a multinational religious body inside the old city, probably headquartered in the old city. But I digress, friends. We are out of time. So if you liked this video, please remember to like and share this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Leave your questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, and critiques in the comment section down below. Please consider following us on the various social media platforms which you frequent. We are on Gab, Parler, Twitter, Minds, and Facebook. You can find links to all of those in the description down below. You can also find a link to our Rumble account in the description down below. I highly recommend that you follow us there because at some point it is very likely we'll be banned on YouTube. Also, if you want to contribute to us financially, you can certainly do so either by subscribing to the Patreon, link in the description, or by giving a one-time donation to the PayPal. Again, link is in the description. I appreciate you guys tremendously for your support, not only in trying to help by watching this and sharing this, but also those of you who are giving financially, who actually think I am worthy of making this into a career. Obviously, what you're saying by doing that is not only that you have faith in what I'm putting forward here, but also that you have faith that you're getting good and reliable news. And I appreciate that from you guys tremendously because, that's the whole point, right? Uh, obviously, we don't want to make a career off being liars, right? Or being unreliable or naive. But at any rate, I appreciate you guys, friends. I want to remind every single one of you to think like Neanderthals. I want to remind every single one of you to be watchdogs. And I want to ask every single one of you the question: in the face of Armageddon, will you compromise